Now we've come to a very important point in our journey through true Christian religion. But if you recall, we've covered God the Creator, the Lord the Redeemer, and now we have the Holy Spirit, or the way God works. We've reached a complete sense of the idea of God. Again, here in this chapter, as he had in previous ones, he has his criticisms of the established Christian church of his day. And he says things like this: I must now also discuss the Divine Trinity, a subject familiar to Christian people, yet actually one they know nothing about. It's a challenging statement, isn't it? And then he goes on and says this, and this is key. From a correct idea of God hangs the whole body of theology, like a chain from its anchor point. If you misunderstand God, the ramifications for the way you understand pretty much everything are enormous. And we're going to explore this idea today. Now, I'm going to just share with you the traditional view of the Trinity. Now, this is very much simplified, and there are many shades and variations to this, so just hold that as a caveat. So we have this idea of the Trinity, Father, Son, and Holy Spirit, as three individual persons, all sharing one essence, and all existing from eternity. That's the sort of basic crux of the way many people understand the Trinity, God. Swedenborg's view, however, is different. It's more like this: one person, and the divisions are degrees or levels of existence rather than individual beings. So he compares Father, Son, and Holy Spirit to soul, body, and activity. He says the Holy Spirit is not God in his own right, but when mentioned in the word means the divine activity which proceeds from the one omnipresent God. That's the Holy Spirit. So an example of that sort of lowest level, the Holy Spirit, is, I think of things like our daughter's artwork. If you visit our house, we have a number of pieces of our daughter's artwork around the house. And we think of Alicia, who lives on the other side of the world, but she has a presence in our house by virtue of these pieces of art. Now, you also might think of a symphony by Beethoven, or a painting by Picasso. A musician will listen to a symphony, particularly Beethoven's symphony. I only need to listen to the smallest fragment and I know, it's Beethoven. You look at a painting by Picasso and you say, oh yes, that's Picasso. Now it's not the person Picasso, but we can see it's his work. And this is what we mean by the Holy Spirit. So when we talk about this Trinity, Father, Son, Holy Spirit, soul, body, activity, it represents another Trinity that Swedenborg talks about. He talks about this one: love, wisdom, and use. And this is the way Swedenborg sees God. Now, there's another important idea that's embedded in this, which is explored in this chapter, and it's the idea of influx. Now, influx or flux means flow. Flow. So influx means to flow in. So there's this idea of flow or influx that Swedenborg describes, and he says something very important about it. He always follows a single direction. It's always from highest to lowest, and it's also always from internal to external. Now, when I apply this idea of influx to myself, the things that I do come out of my own inner nature, rather than being caused by the circumstances in which I find myself. So, for example, you might be driving along and reach what you think is going to be a green light, and then at the last minute it turns red. Now, you might become very frustrated by that. And you might even say something like, I'm frustrated, the light turning red made me frustrated. Well, that's not the case. A light turning red cannot make you frustrated, because it would make every single person who approached a red light frustrated. The frustration comes from within. Now, here's an example of Swedenborg talking about this. All things done by man flow out from the interiors belonging to his mind, which is the all in everything a man does. And this idea is deeply challenging to us because it puts the responsibility for my actions squarely on my own shoulders. I can't blame anybody for anything that I do. And we do tend to, don't we? We get frustrated with other people, we get angry with them, and we lash out. It's not their fault, they're not the cause of that lashing out, we are. And say that is a deeply challenging notion for many people. Now, this idea of influx also helps us understand some of the things we find in Swedenborg and some of the things we find in the Word. So here's an example of something he wrote in True Christian Religion in this chapter. And it's headed, "The Lord works of himself from the Father and not the reverse." And he goes on, "These plain sayings of the Lord show up the manifest error of the Christian world, that it is God the Father who sends the Holy Spirit to men, as well as the error of the Greek Church, that God the Father sends him without any mediation." Now, at first you look at a statement like that and you think, what's he really talking about here? What does this mean? What's the relevance of this? And you realise that actually the relevance of it is this process of influx, that everything comes through from the highest level, the inmost level, the level of love. It flows through wisdom, which is the Son, the Lord, and then it flows out into use, and it must follow that sequence. It doesn't jump anything and it doesn't go the other way. It always goes from love to wisdom to use. This is what he's talking about here. And this is why he's making this particular point. But then we turn to the Word and we have this that I read from John's Gospel. "All things that the Father has are mine. Therefore I said that he, the Spirit of truth, will take of mine and declare it to you." Okay, so all things the Father has, that being love, are mine. It falls down into the wisdom level. "Therefore I said that he, the Spirit of truth, will take of mine, of the wisdom, and declare it to you." So again, there's that coming down in influx. There's a very definite order to this. Now, I want to give you an example of why this idea is so important. It's the sacrificial system. Now, if you listen to atheistic scientists, they will give you an account of how religion came to be. And the story goes something like this, that somewhere back in the mists of time, some caveman somewhere came up with a little ritual and something happened. Something good happened because of the ritual that he'd done. So he thought, I'll try that again and see if it happens again. And over time it develops a ritual such that if I offer a certain sacrifice, then good things happen to me. And they say the same thing about prayer. If I offer a prayer to my God, then good things happen to me, you see. And so this is how they explain the origin of religion. But Swedenborg's understanding of the origin of religion is fundamentally different. His explanation of the origin of religion is that mankind had a deep connection with God at one point in our history, such that we had we lived in this physical world, but we saw through it into the spiritual world. There was just this ready perception everybody had. And the sacrificial system, far from being trying to, cozy up to God and make him feel good about me so he blesses me with what I want, it was actually a representation of what I need to do. It's a representation of the fact that something within me needs to be expressed, to be real. It's a very different way of looking at this idea of sacrifice. And Swedenborg will say that sacrifice can only ever be an expression of what is within. It's never, and it can never work as, a bargaining chip with God. That would be to make the outer works of a thing, the physical thing we do, make a difference at a higher level, which it can't. It's like making a water flow uphill. It doesn't happen. Now we have that in parables like the Pharisee and the tax collector. You know the little parable, the two men go to the temple to pray. They're both doing the same external activity, but the difference is the heart of each. Here's a couple of things now to then apply this to the idea of God. You've got to get your picture of God right. And much of the traditional notion of the Christian message hangs on to a God that just doesn't work. It hangs on to a God who is fundamentally hostile towards his children, to such a point where Jesus needed to be offered as a sacrifice on the cross to clear that blockage. And that is contrary to the notion of love. You see, love, right in the middle of that model, driving the whole thing. You cannot contradict that. God cannot contradict his own inner nature. So there's this idea which is contrary to the nature of love, which we need to remove. The other side of it is this idea that somehow God can be placated by an external ritual. Even the sacrifice of a human being. An external thing can never change something that is higher than it. If Jesus' sacrifice were to change God's attitude to us, it would be that water flowing uphill. It would be a physical action changing something that is internal, which does not happen. So to get our idea of God right, we'd have these two ideas that Swedenborg offers us. The nature of love and this influx idea that flow is always from what is internal to what is external and never the opposite way around. So the idea of the traditional notion of the atonement is based entirely upon a corrupted idea of the sacrificial system. Nothing the Lord did on earth could make any difference or change to the love that God feels for us. That love is constant and consistent. And so we can be reassured that the Lord's endeavour is always our regeneration. What the Lord worked for to achieve in his life in this world, we can be assured that the Lord continues to work in that same direction in each of our lives individually. And that is the work of the Holy Spirit. Having established the possibility of us choosing heaven over hell, the Lord continues to work in such a way that encourages us to make that choice. And so Swedenborg writes this: the divine power and activity meant by the Holy Spirit are, generally speaking, reformation and regeneration, which leads to renewal, quickening, sanctification and justification. And these lead to purification from evils and the forgiveness of sins and ultimately to salvation. That is the entirety of the Lord's effort in our lives. Got another one to share with you. Now, since the Lord is divine truth itself, coming from the divine good, there's that flow again, and this is his essence, and since everyone acts as he does by reason of his essential nature, this proves that it is constantly the Lord's will to impart truth and good, that is, faith and charity, in every person, and his will could not be any different. So God is not our enemy, and he never has been. In fact, we are our own worst enemies. You see, the thing that the Lord seeks to save us from is ourselves. Now, that seems an odd thing to say, but it's not an unfamiliar idea. We know how we resist things that are good for us. We resist exercise. We resist healthy eating. We tend towards self-indulgence and taking the easy road in so many ways. And these are all familiar failings to us. We know that we do this. So why is it so hard for us to believe the same principle applies spiritually? Okay, I want to round all of this off and just want to talk about the effect upon me of reading these 3 chapters. So I've always been regarded as fairly tolerant of different points of view, different opinions. And some people will tell me I'm too tolerant of different opinions. But reading the words of this chapter, these 3 chapters, and contemplating them, I can see that these 2 views of God, of the Trinity, are actually completely incompatible with one another. So often I talk to people about our doctrines, and what I think happens is that they carry with them their own old theology, and they try and massage the 2 together to understand them, and I don't think it works. Because when you look at the core of them, of these 2 models, they are fundamentally different. And because the core of it is so different, then the whole thing falls apart. You know, Swedenborg writes things like, the new church is established in Gentile states. In other words, the Lord needs a clean slate for ideas of truth, divine ideas of truth, to take hold. You can't massage divine truth into old ideas, that the 2 just do not work together. The Lord talked about new wine in old wineskins. You remember that little parable he uses. You can't put the 2 together. So when we approach new church teaching, one of the things a newcomer, a new reader has to do is get to the point where they abandon the old, or they will abandon the new. Ultimately, you can't have the 2 sitting side by side. But on the other hand, I just want to point out that it's a journey. It's a journey. I don't know how many of you have read this little book, The Heavenly City, otherwise known as the New Jerusalem and its Heavenly Doctrine. If you want to find a short book that kind of encapsulates all of New Church teaching, this is it. Okay, so this is a very, very thin volume and very easy to read. But I've always been interested in the contrast between this book and True Christian Religion, because in this book, the Lord is at the end. Whereas in True Christian Religion, the first thing Swedenborg has dealt with is the Lord, the Trinity. And I've often wondered why. And I think the 2 books kind of represent stages in the process. You know, this is kind of a really good introduction to New Church teaching, but you need to get to the point where the Lord, from being the end of the process, is the beginning. And once you've reached that, once you've taken in that first model, then everything else will fall into place and naturally flows out from it. Anyway, I'll be interested to hear what you think of the ideas that I've shared, and interested to hear about your journey, your process in learning who the Lord is and what his effect is upon your life.